She was 10 years old, she told her mother. Her mother went directly to the most powerful man in Hollywood and told him exactly what had happened, and he laughed. That single moment tells you everything you need to know about how Hollywood's golden age really worked. And tonight, we are going to show you 8 more moments exactly like it. The man who was the system, Louis B. Mayer. She was a teenager when she walked through the gates of MGM for the first time. Lana Turner, dark-haired, luminous, possessed of a quality the camera seemed almost unable to look away from, had arrived at the most celebrated studio in Hollywood history. She had come to make films. What she had actually entered, though she could not yet know it, was a machine, and the machine had no interest in what she wanted. It had interest only in what she was worth. Those who knew Turner in those early years described a young woman of genuine warmth and considerable personal ambition. Someone who read voraciously, who wanted to be taken seriously as a dramatic actress, who spoke often about the kinds of complex roles she hoped to one day play. She had opinions about her work that she was not shy about expressing. She had a vision of the performer she wanted to become that had nothing to do with the blonde glamour the studio had already decided to construct around her. She wanted a career built on her terms, shaped by her choices, reflecting her own understanding of what she was capable of. Those wants were real. They simply did not factor into any calculation MGM made about her. Understanding what happened to Lana Turner at MGM and to dozens of others across 3 decades requires first understanding the man who designed the machine she had walked into. Louis B. Mayer was not simply a powerful figure. He was a structural phenomenon. At the apex of Hollywood's most celebrated studio, he occupied every role simultaneously. Employer, moral authority, financial lifeline, career maker, and the sole court of appeal available to anyone who worked for him. He had not exploited a gap in the institution's framework. He had built the institution himself, specifically without a gap above his own position. His office was not a room. It was a statement. Visitors who entered found themselves looking up, the desk elevated on a platform, the chairs arranged at a precise psychological disadvantage. His manner alternated between volcanic rage and something that could, in its warmer moments, feel genuinely paternal. He wept in contract negotiations, not occasionally, routinely. Those who encountered it described the experience of watching a man of such evident power dissolve into tears as genuinely disorienting, as though the laws of gravity had briefly suspended themselves. Stars regularly left his office, having agreed to terms they had entered, determined to refuse. The tears were documented. The technique was deliberate. The results were consistent. This is the machinery we must understand before we can understand anything else about what happened at MGM. Mayer had engineered his own unaccountability into every layer of the institution he ran. The paternal warmth was a management system. The elevated desk was a management system. Until the tears were a management system, and the absence of any reporting structure above his own position was the most important management system of all. Turner had dreams that had nothing to do with the studio's calculations. She wanted to be taken seriously as a performer. She wanted to choose her own roles, her own relationships, her own life. By the time she fully understood what MGM's contract meant for those wants, she was too valuable and too contractually imprisoned to act on the understanding. The studio controlled her image with a thoroughness that extended into every corner of her personal life. When she became involved with men considered unsuitable for her public persona, fixers intervened, not as a courtesy but as a contractual function. When her personal circumstances threatened her screen image, the publicity department did not merely manage the story, they rewrote it. She was not an employee navigating a difficult workplace. She was an asset being maintained, her value protected with the same diligence the studio applied to its camera equipment and its sound stages. And then came the evening of April 4th, 1958, and everything that followed it. Johnny Stompanato had been in Turner's life for some time. A volatile, controlling presence whose behavior toward her had escalated into something her daughter Cheryl Crane could no longer watch without responding to it. What Cheryl did that evening, in the kitchen of their home, to protect her mother, became one of the most sensational news events of the decade. Within hours, some accounts say within minutes, MGM's attorney Jerry Giesler was present, not the following morning, that night. The inquest that followed was managed with the studio's interests as its organizing principle. Testimony was shaped. Narrative was guided. The outcome, justifiable in the eyes of the law, was reached in a manner that protected both the family and, not incidentally, the studio's investment in Lana Turner's continued commercial viability. Here is what that sequence of events reveals most clearly. The system that had controlled Turner for 2 decades, that had managed her relationships, supervised her image, and treated her personal life as studio property, now deployed those same resources to protect her, not because it had suddenly discovered loyalty, because she was still valuable. The machine's devotion was always to the asset. It was never to the person. No one stopped Louis B. Mayer because Louis B. Mayer was the stopping mechanism. Every complaint, every grievance, every report of misconduct at MGM traveled up a chain of command that ended at his desk. Reporting him meant reporting to him. There was no authority above his position to receive the complaint, because he had built his institution specifically without one. The system was not broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, and that design was his. He passed away in 1957, having never been formally sanctioned by any institution for any aspect of his conduct toward the human beings in his care. The dream factory he built continues to be celebrated. The machinery he constructed beneath it deserves to be understood with equal clarity. The punishment for speaking. Harry Cohn. Harry Cohn was not subtle. He made no particular effort to be discreet. Studio executives knew. Contract players knew. The press had heard enough to form a reasonably complete picture. So why, across 3 decades of documented behavior at Columbia Pictures, did no one with the power to act ever act? The answer has nothing to do with ignorance. It has everything to do with what Cohn had learned about the relationship between power and silence, and what happened, specifically and visibly, to the people who tested that relationship. He had grown up poor and had fought for everything he possessed, and somewhere in that fight, he had arrived at an understanding that would govern his entire career. Power, he grasped with the clarity of a man who had started with none of it, is not primarily about what you can do to people. It is about what people believe you can do to them, and what they believe is determined, more than anything else, by what they have watched happen to the people who tried to find out. His office reflected this understanding in its physical dimensions. The desk was elevated. Every visitor looked up at him. The arrangement was not accidental. Neither was his surveillance apparatus. Columbia employed individuals whose function included monitoring the private lives of contract players, their relationships, their associations, their conversations in spaces they believed to be unobserved. He was not simply watching. He was ensuring that everyone understood they were being watched. The distinction mattered enormously. A man who watches has information. A man who ensures you know he is watching has something more useful than information. He has the behavior that information would have produced without the expense of acting on it. Kim Novak had arrived at Columbia in the early 1950s with a quality the camera found irresistible and a spirit that her closest friends described as genuinely free. A young woman from Chicago who had worked as a model, who loved jazz, who had come to Hollywood with her own ideas about what kind of performer she wanted to become. Those ideas were, from the moment she signed her Columbia contract, no longer entirely hers to act on. Cohn's management of her career was total and documented. Her image, her roles, her public presentation, all administered according to his calculation of her commercial value rather than her own preferences or gifts. When Novak became romantically involved with Sammy Davis Jr., a relationship Cohn considered incompatible with the persona he had constructed for her, he intervened. The intervention was not subtle and was not required to be. The message was delivered with the confidence of a man who had made the arithmetic clear over 3 decades. Her career existed at his discretion, and his discretion was exercised according to compliance. The relationship ended, and when those who witnessed it asked themselves what their own options were if they ever found themselves in Novak's position, the answer the evidence produced was not encouraging. This was not an isolated incident. It was policy, administered consistently enough that the consistency itself became the message. Every contract player at Columbia understood, without requiring explicit instruction, the terms under which their career operated. The contractual mechanism deserves to be named precisely because it was the instrument of control and it was elegant in its cruelty. Stars who spoke, who complained, who refused, who contacted outside counsel or the press, faced immediate suspension, not termination, suspension. Under their Columbia contracts, suspension meant they continued to receive nothing while being legally prohibited from working elsewhere. They were not freed to find another studio. They were frozen in place, their careers stalled, their income eliminated, while Cohn waited for the calculation to produce its intended result. Columbia actress Judy Holliday, one of the most gifted comic performers of her generation, or an Academy Award winner whose talent was beyond serious dispute, discovered what this mechanism felt like in practice during a period of professional friction with the studio. Those close to her during that time described a woman who understood with complete clarity that her options had been reduced by a contractual document she had signed years earlier to 2, comply or wait. The waiting was not neutral. It was its own form of pressure, applied with patience and with the knowledge that the clock running on her career was running only in one direction. She was not the only one to experience this calculation firsthand. She was simply one of the most gifted people to whom Columbia had occasion to apply it. The punishment was not being dismissed. The punishment was being made to wait, unable to work, unable to earn, as while the clock ran on their most productive years. And when those frozen stars finally asked themselves whether speaking had been worth it, the answer the arithmetic produced was the answer Cohn had always intended. No one could afford that weight, and Cohn knew it. He had done the arithmetic before any of them arrived. When he passed away in 1958, the crowd at his funeral was so large that it generated its own legend. Red Skelton, observing the throng, offered the observation that if you give people what they want, they will show up for it. And what people apparently wanted, in extraordinary numbers, was confirmation that Harry Cohn was genuinely in the ground. Let the record show that they got what they came for. The laughter that met this remark was the sound of an industry exhaling 30 years of enforced silence. They could only laugh at him once he was gone. The timing of that laughter is the clearest possible measure of how completely his calculation had worked. Within months, the same industry had rebuilt the same structures around different men. Cohn was gone. The contractual imprisonment, the surveillance, the arithmetic of silence was not. The day the system chose to laugh, Arthur Freed. What happens to a system of accountability the moment it is genuinely tested, not threatened with being tested, not approached tentatively by someone uncertain of their standing, actually tested by the right person at the right level, with a specific and credible account of specific behavior directed at a child? What does every witness to that moment learn about the value of speaking? And what does it mean when the answer is nothing? Let us sit with the full weight of that question before we answer it. Because the answer matters not just for what it tells us about one morning in one office at one studio. It matters for what it tells us about how silence is manufactured inside institutions, not through threats, not through contracts, not through surveillance apparatus or elevated desks, but through a single, visible, clearly communicated choice, made once, at the right moment, in front of the right people. A choice whose consequences traveled through every corridor of that institution and arrived, intact and unambiguous, at every person who might ever have considered speaking. The message did not need to be repeated. It needed only to have been sent. The films Arthur Freed produced at MGM represent some of the most joyful, most innocent, and the most beloved titles in the history of cinema. Singin' in the Rain, An American in Paris, Meet Me in St. Louis, Gigi, The Wizard of Oz. Films of such apparently boundless delight in the possibilities of music and movement and the human capacity for happiness that generations of audiences have returned to them across more than 70 years. These are not simply popular films. They are films that people carry through their lives, films that belong in the specific emotional geography of the people who love them, to the category of things that feel like home. Those films were made in specific buildings, on specific sound stages in Culver City, California. And in those same buildings, at an identifiable moment in time, a report had been made, and a choice had been taken. And everyone who worked inside those buildings knew what both of them were. The films and the knowledge occupied the same physical space. They always had. We are simply, finally, naming the geography honestly. Shirley Temple was 10 years old when Arthur Freed summoned her to his office at MGM. She was not an unknown. She was among the most recognized faces in American cinema, a child performer whose work had generated extraordinary commercial returns, and whose name carried a cultural weight that most adult performers never achieved. She had spent years in professional environments that gave her an unusual and specific kind of maturity, an understanding of institutional hierarchies, of the weight that authority carried, of what it meant to be in the presence of someone with significant power over your professional life. It's and what she could not have understood, walking through that door, was what the afternoon was going to teach her about the system she was working inside. What Freed did in that office, she documented herself, not through an intermediary, in her own words, in her own autobiography, published in 1988 when she was 60 years old, and had lived long enough to decide that what she had experienced deserved to be named clearly, rather than buried under the same silence that had protected the institution that failed to protect her. The act of writing it was itself a form of courage, the kind that looks quiet from the outside, but is not quiet at all. She left his office and went directly to her mother. Her mother did what a mother presented with that account should do. She identified the person with the authority to act. She walked toward his office with the entirely reasonable expectation that the most powerful man at MGM, presented with a specific and credible account of what had happened to a 10-year-old child in Arthur Freed's office, would do what power is supposed to do when it is given the opportunity to protect someone who cannot protect herself. For one moment, the moment her mother walked toward Louis B. Mayer's office, it appeared that the system might work, that the correct authority had been identified, that every step had been taken correctly. The child had told her mother. The mother had gone to the authority. The authority was about to be given its opportunity to respond. For one moment, the system looked like a system. Louis B. Mayer laughed. He did not investigate. He did not suspend Freed pending any form of review. He did not express concern, not for the child, not for the conduct that had been described to him, not for the implications of what he was being told about someone operating at a senior level within his studio. He did not request additional information or indicate in any way that what had been reported to him constituted a matter requiring his attention. He laughed, and he moved on. That laugh was not a private reaction. It was a communication, and it traveled through every informal network that constituted MGM's real nervous system. The conversations between assistants, between contract players, between crew members who understood exactly how information moved through those buildings, with a precision and a reach that no formal policy document could have matched. Like everyone who needed to know what Mayer had done when given the opportunity to act, eventually knew. And everyone who knew was now in possession of the same institutional intelligence. The door that was supposed to be open was closed. It had always been closed. It had simply taken this specific moment to make the closure visible. The system had been offered a choice, clearly, irrevocably, in front of witnesses. We should sit with what this meant for the people who heard about it, because it is easy to process abstractly, and it should not be processed abstractly. There were people at MGM who may have had their own experiences with Arthur Freed's behavior, who may have been running, in the private arithmetic that people in vulnerable positions are always running, the question of whether speaking was possible. And those people heard what Mayer had done. They ran the arithmetic again, with the new data included, and the result was unambiguous. The most credible report that could have been made. A mother, a child, a specific event, described directly to the most powerful authority available, had produced a laugh and a continuation of business as usual. If that account had produced nothing, then no account delivered by anyone less positioned could reasonably be expected to produce more. After that moment, the question of why no one at MGM reported Arthur Freed's behavior has a specific and precise answer that has nothing to do with individual cowardice. Someone had reported it. The report had been received at the highest possible level. The highest possible level had chosen non-response. Every person who heard what Meyer had done now possessed the same information. Speaking was not merely risky, it was demonstrably pointless, and futility for people trying to decide whether to absorb a significant personal cost in exchange for an institutional outcome is the most powerful deterrent that exists. Freed continued producing films at MGM for more than 2 decades after that morning in Meyer's office. 20 years of celebrated productions, 20 years during which the laugh that had traveled through every corridor of that institution continued to shape the calculations of everyone who worked alongside him. The soundstages where the most beloved moments in Hollywood history were captured, where Gene Kelly danced in the rain, where the extraordinary choreographic visions of those productions were brought into being with a technical mastery that has never been surpassed. Contained within the same walls, the knowledge of what the system had chosen when it was given the opportunity to choose. That is not metaphor, that is geography, and it deserves to be named as such, clearly and without the softening that the beauty of those films makes it tempting to apply. In 1952, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences awarded Arthur Freed the Irving G. Thalberg Memorial Award, the Academy's highest honor for producing achievement. The institution that existed to recognize excellence in American cinema presented its most prestigious producing honor to a man whose behavior had been reported to the head of his studio 11 years earlier and protected without hesitation. The Academy did not make this award in ignorance. The story of what had happened in Meyer's office was the kind of story that traveled through an industry as interconnected as Hollywood. They awarded it because they had decided, without requiring explicit discussion, that what they knew did not constitute a relevant variable in the calculation they were making. The films weighed more, and in the arithmetic of that institution, in that era, they always would. The institution that could have stopped him chose instead to celebrate him. The system was tested once, at the highest possible level, and in the clearest possible terms. It chose to laugh. And then, 11 years later, it dressed up and handed the man it had protected its highest available distinction. That sequence, report, laughter, award, is not a footnote in the history of Hollywood's golden age. It is the history, not a dark exception to a story that otherwise holds together cleanly. The story itself, told honestly, from the inside, with the geography named correctly, the films and the knowledge, the soundstages and the silence, all of it, together, in the same buildings, all of it, together, the truth. If you find yourself moved by these stories, if you believe that the full truth of Hollywood's golden age is worth understanding, stay with us here at Golden Age Files. Every week we bring you the history that the studios spent decades trying to bury. We told with the care and the honesty these stories have always deserved. Subscribe now so you never miss what we uncover next. The 35 million witness, Hedda Hopper. Every protection mechanism we have examined so far required an institution, a studio contract, a chain of command, a figure at its apex who chose not to act. Hedda Hopper needed none of these things. She was a failed actress who had converted a newspaper column into a form of power that made studio heads write her apologetic letters. The question of how that happened and what it reveals about where power in Hollywood actually lived is the question this chapter exists to answer. At the height of her influence in the 1940s and 50s, Hopper's column reached 35 million readers. 35 million Americans, predominantly women, who read what she wrote about the people who made their favorite films. This number dwarfed the audience of any individual film in release. It exceeded the readership of most American newspapers taken individually. It represented a distribution network for reputation, positive or negative, that no studio's publicity department could match or effectively counter. She was not powerful because studio heads feared her personally, though some of them did. She was powerful because 35 million readers represented the primary cinema audience, the women whose ticket purchases determined whether a film succeeded or failed commercially. Hopper's column was a direct line to those women, and she had made it sufficiently clear, over sufficient time, that she controlled what traveled through that line. Her column was not journalism in any conventional sense of the word. It was the deployment of readership as leverage, practiced with remarkable consistency and considerable skill. Stars who cooperated with her, who provided exclusives, who granted access, who demonstrated appropriate deference, found themselves described warmly in her pages. Those who crossed her, or whose views she found politically objectionable, or who simply failed to provide what she considered adequate cooperation, discovered that the column's tone toward them could shift with an efficiency that had measurable professional consequences. Charlie Chaplin's experience of Hopper's column illustrates the mechanism most clearly. Her political objections to Chaplin were genuine. She found his left-leaning sympathies not merely disagreeable, but, in the climate of the late 1940s, actionable. What she proceeded to do with those objections was to convert them into a sustained campaign conducted through her column over multiple years, contributing materially to the atmosphere of suspicion that preceded his decision not to return to America from Europe in 1952. She had not presented evidence of wrongdoing in any legal sense. She had presented her readership consistently to an audience of 35 million, and she had shaped what that readership believed. Chaplin, one of the most celebrated artists in the history of cinema, spent the last 25 years of his life in exile, in significant part because of what traveled through that column. He was never formally charged with anything. He was simply made. He now by 35 million readers and the woman who directed them, unwelcome in the country, whose audiences had loved him most. Ingrid Bergman understood this mechanism from a different angle. When Bergman's personal life became the subject of public controversy in 1949, Hopper was among the voices that ensured the controversy reached the widest possible audience in the most damaging possible framing. Bergman, who had been, until that moment, among the most beloved actresses in America, celebrated for roles of warmth and moral clarity, found herself on the receiving end of a column that treated her private choices as a public offense. The campaign that followed contributed to an absence from Hollywood that lasted 7 years. 7 years of a career interrupted, of an audience that had adored her, now uncertain what to think. Guided in their uncertainty by a woman in a spectacular hat who had decided that Bergman's choices were incompatible with the image her readership preferred. When Bergman finally returned, it was to an industry that had moved on without her. The years could not be recovered. The column that had shaped those years had already found its next subject. The mechanism that made Hopper immune to challenge must be stated with precision. Challenging her publicly produced the outcome she was threatening privately. Any star or executive who attacked her in public gave her a conflict to write about, and conflict was the primary engine of her column's appeal. Attacking her meant becoming her story. Becoming her story meant 35 million readers receiving, over the following days and weeks, a version of events narrated by Hedda Hopper from Hedda Hopper's perspective. There was no counter-distribution network available to her targets. There was no equivalent platform from which a rebuttal could reach the same audience. The rational response was not resistance. It was management, feeding her acceptable material, maintaining the performance of cooperation, and directing her attention, when possible, toward someone else. From above, from editors and publishers, the financial reality was equally prohibitive. Her column generated revenue. Replacing her meant replacing 35 million readers, and no editor possessed both the authority and the financial recklessness to make that calculation come out in favor of replacement. She was stopped eventually only by the natural conclusion of her era. She passed away in 1966. Her column ceased with her passing. No institution had stopped her. No editor had overruled her. No star had successfully challenged her and survived professionally intact. Time was the only force that proved equal to 35 million readers and a willingness to use them. For the people who had lived inside the range of that column, who had watched their reputations shaped, their relationships questioned, their careers redirected by what she chose to write, the passage of time was a cold comfort, but it was the only one the system ever offered them. The room where wounds were currency, Lee Strasberg. He required nothing from his students except everything, their memories, their traumas, their most private griefs, excavated in public, in a room full of peers. On his instruction and under his evaluation. They gave these things willingly, because he had made himself the guardian of the only door that led to serious work. And the question this chapter must answer is, what happens when the person holding that door decides that what passes through it belongs to him? The Actors Studio, in the 1950s and early 1960s, was not merely a prestigious institution. It was the recognized arbiter of what serious American performance meant. Marlon Brando, James Dean, Paul Newman, Anne Bancroft. The names that had passed through it constituted a roll call of the most significant American performers of the century. The studio's approval was a form of artistic currency that translated directly into professional opportunity, into the roles, the directors, onto the productions that defined a serious career. Lee Strasberg had not simply become the studio's director. He had become the studio, inseparable from it in public perception and irreplaceable within it by institutional design. This was not accidental. He had cultivated this identification over years with the deliberateness of a man who understood that his power was the institution's power, and that the institution's power was most complete when the two could not be distinguished from each other. The asymmetry this created was total. Students who questioned his methods or his judgment risked not merely his personal disapproval, but their standing within the only community whose approval defined their professional identity. Leaving the studio was not equivalent to leaving a difficult teacher. It was equivalent to surrendering a credential, and in the specific cultural moment of that era, it was a credential for which no equivalent substitution existed. Marilyn Monroe came to Strasberg at a point in her career when her gifts were beyond serious question, and her confidence in those gifts was considerably more fragile. What followed, documented by multiple first-hand sources and by Monroe's own recorded statements, was a relationship of profound psychological dependency that served Strasberg's professional standing and public authority in ways that were specific and measurable. He became her acting coach, her artistic authority, her primary source of professional validation. And here is where the dependency became visible, in ways that those around her found increasingly difficult to watch without speaking, and found themselves unable to speak about without consequences they were not prepared to absorb. Monroe would not begin a scene on any set without Paula Strasberg, Lee's wife, functioning as his on-set representative, physically present and within her line of sight. Productions waited. Directors negotiated. Schedules were reconstructed around the Strasberg's availability. Those who raised concerns about this arrangement discovered that raising concerns about Monroe's dependence on her acting coach meant, in practical terms, raising concerns about the most recognized woman in the world's ability to function. And no studio was willing to have that conversation on the record. She was encouraged, across this period, to rely on Strasberg's judgment over that of directors, producers, and colleagues with whom she had established working relationships. Her dependency deepened as her professional circumstances grew more complicated. The studio and its director became the fixed point around which everything else in her professional life orbited, and the man at the center of that fixed point became, with each passing year, more indispensable, more visible, more credentialed, more celebrated as the guardian of her gift. When Monroe passed away in 1962, her will, signed during the period of Strasberg's greatest influence over her, conveyed to him a significant portion of control over her estate and image rights. He subsequently built a commercial licensing operation around her likeness that generated considerable wealth across the decades that followed. The woman who had trusted him with her deepest artistic wounds had left him the rights to her face. Whether this reflected the genuine wishes of a woman who loved her teacher, or the accumulated consequence of years of cultivated dependency, is a question the available evidence does not resolve with certainty. That ambiguity is itself part of the story, and it is the part that the system was never required to examine. No institution had a mechanism for examining it. The Actors Studio was a private organization. Its internal dynamics were subject to no external oversight. These students who challenged Strasberg's authority faced the choice that was not a choice: accept it or surrender the credential it conferred. And no one with a career to protect could afford that surrender. He passed away in 1982, having spent the intervening 2 decades managing the Monroe estate with considerable commercial success. The room where wounds were offered as the price of artistic legitimacy had produced, in the end, a return on that price that only one person in the room had fully understood from the beginning. The Gospel according to DeMille, Cecil B. DeMille. He made the 10 Commandments. Twice. He made it once in the silent era, and then, in 1956, he made it again. A production of such scale and such evident moral earnestness that it became one of the highest-grossing films in the history of American cinema. He was, in the public imagination, Hollywood's great moral storyteller, the man who had brought the laws of God to the screen with a conviction that seemed, from the outside, entirely genuine. So what did the people who worked on those productions say about the laws that governed his sets? And why, when they said it, did no one in Hollywood seem particularly surprised? DeMille's productions were events of a scale that was itself a form of power. His sets employed thousands of people. His budgets represented, in many cases, a significant portion of a studio's annual expenditure. His films generated revenue that underwrote entire fiscal years, and this scale created a specific dynamic that governed every complaint, every concern, every account of conditions on his productions. No individual grievance could be weighed on a scale that also held the financial and institutional weight of a DeMille film and come out heavier. A crew member's injury, an actor's documented distress, these were small numbers in a very large equation, and DeMille understood this arithmetic with complete clarity. He had been doing it for decades. The accounts from cast and crew who worked on his major productions are consistent in their descriptions of conditions that subordinated human safety to visual ambition. The water sequences on his biblical epics placed performers in genuine physical jeopardy for the achievement of an image. Sequences that required people to remain in the water for hours under conditions that those present described, in accounts recorded after the fact, as alarming in ways that had nothing to do with dramatic performance. The production of Samson and Delilah in 1949 offers a documented illustration. The physical demands placed on performers during the production's most elaborate sequences were described by those present as operating at the boundary of what the human body could reasonably be asked to sustain under studio conditions. When concerns were raised, and they were raised through the appropriate channels, and by people who understood the risk they were taking in raising them, the response was a production schedule that continued unchanged and a reminder, delivered with the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to make a point, that the performers on a DeMille production were expected to meet the demands of the production, not the other way around. Crowd sequences in which thousands of individuals were managed as visual material left their individual safety as a secondary operational consideration. Those who raised concerns were heard, and then the next day's shooting schedule was distributed unchanged. His psychological approach to performers was documented with equal consistency. The dressing down delivered in front of the full company, the expression of contempt directed at someone who had failed to meet his standards, the deliberate use of public shame as a technique for extracting compliance. Those who witnessed it described the experience as genuinely unsettling. Those who experienced it directly described something closer to devastation. And those who considered speaking about it, who considered filing a complaint, who considered contacting a guild representative, who considered saying out loud what they had experienced, encountered a wall of language that stopped them before they reached any formal process. Because here is where the protection mechanism reveals itself most completely. and it is the most insidious protection in this entire documentary. On a DeMille production, suffering was not evidence of something wrong. It was evidence of something right. And the industry had collectively, gradually, over decades of his career, arrived at a shared language in which his harsh methods and his ambition were indistinguishable from each other. To endure DeMille was to demonstrate commitment. To complain about DeMille was to demonstrate its absence. The complaint was self-defeating by design, not because DeMille had constructed this reframing deliberately as a legal strategy, but because the industry had agreed to call his methods by a name that made accountability structurally impossible. There was no external body with sufficient authority to challenge a production of his financial scale. There was no critical vocabulary available to the people who endured hardship that did not immediately convert their experience into evidence of their own insufficient dedication. Suffering on a DeMille set was renamed Devotion, and once it had been renamed, no one inside the system had the language left to call it anything else. He passed away in 1959. His legacy in the history of cinema remains substantial. But the mechanism that surrounded that legacy, the industry's agreement to call harsh treatment by a different name, deserves to be understood as clearly as the films themselves, because that agreement did not retire with him. It simply found new sets to operate on. What the congressional record forgot, Darryl F. Zanuck. There exists a congressional record, testimony taken under oath, describing conditions at major Hollywood studios during the tenure of Darryl F. Zanuck at 20th Century Fox. That record did not disappear. It was not sealed or classified or lost in a fire, and it was examined by the appropriate committees and then, with a consistency that extended across every institutional level that encountered it, set aside. And the question of why requires only one piece of arithmetic. Her name was Bella Darby. She had arrived in Hollywood from Europe, Polish-born, dark-eyed, possessed of a quality that Zanuck had noticed immediately and decided to act on. He and his wife had taken her up with what appeared, to those who observed it, to be genuine personal affection. She was brought into their household, introduced to their circle, and then introduced to the cameras at 20th Century Fox. Her career at Fox existed entirely at Zanuck's personal discretion. Her continued presence in Hollywood depended on his continued interest. The professional and the personal had been made, and from the beginning of her time there, impossible to separate. She was not in a position to refuse the conditions her career required, and the people around her understood this without anyone needing to say it. Darby's story was not unique at Fox. It was representative. The pattern of behavior toward actresses under Fox contract is documented across multiple accounts consistent in their description of exploitative casting practices as standard operating procedure under Zanuck's authority. Those who were present during this period and who later spoke about it described an atmosphere in which the arrangements were understood without requiring explicit acknowledgement. What is universally understood need never be spoken. What is never spoken cannot be exhibited in evidence. And the institutionalization of silence was itself a form of protection, and it was a form of protection that had been in place at Fox for decades before any congressional investigator arrived. Zanuck was one of the most genuinely significant studio heads in Hollywood history. This is not a concession made to balance the account. It is a fact essential to understanding the mechanism that protected him. His tenure at Fox produced films of real artistic and social importance, films that engaged with American life with a seriousness that the era's commercial pressures made genuinely remarkable. He had taste, authority, and a creative intelligence that shaped the output of one of the industry's most important studios across decades. And that output was the arithmetic. Every institution with the authority to act, the studio board, the industry guilds, the press, the congressional investigators who had received testimony, weighed the documented conduct against the documented output and arrived at the same result. The films were worth more than the testimony, not because anyone said this explicitly, because the calculations they made, each one separately and on its own terms, all produced the same number. The congressional record is where this chapter's argument reaches its sharpest point. Investigators received testimony. The testimony described, under oath, the conditions that existed at major studios. The record contains this testimony. For a brief moment, the moment that testimony was entered into the record, the moment investigators convened to examine it, it appeared that the arithmetic might produce a different result, that the weight of sworn statements from real people about real conditions might finally exceed the weight of box office receipts and studio output. It did not. The record contains no consequence for Zanuck personally, no formal sanction, no industry action, no accountability of any kind that could be traced to what the investigators had heard. The testimony was set aside so thoroughly and so efficiently that most people who loved the films Fox produced under his tenure have never encountered its existence. Zanuck was eventually removed from Fox. The year was 1962. The proximate cause was a film called Cleopatra, a production of such catastrophic financial scale that it brought the studio to the edge of financial collapse. He was removed because the studio could not absorb the financial consequences of the production he had authorized. The 3 decades of documented and congressionally recorded conduct had produced, across those 3 decades, precisely no removal, no formal sanction, and no institutional consequence of any measurable kind. He was removed for the money, not for the conduct. That sequence, testimony, non-consequence, removal for budget, is not a footnote in the history of Hollywood's golden age. It is the answer to the title's question, stated with the precision of a balance sheet. And it is an answer that Bella Darby, who spent her later years in considerable difficulty and passed away in 1971, never lived to see acknowledged. And we are approaching the final chapter of this story, and the most important question of all still awaits its answer. Before we get there, we would be grateful if you shared your thoughts in the comments below. Which of these protection mechanisms strikes you as the most disturbing? And which aspect of Hollywood's golden age would you most like us to examine next? We read every comment, and your answers genuinely shape what we explore. Leave yours below. The chairman's retaliation policy, Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was not a studio head. He did not run a production company or control a distribution network or sit at the top of a chain of command that employed thousands of people. He was a singer, the greatest singer of his generation, and by many measures the greatest singer the 20th century produced. So the question of how a singer acquired the kind of power that made studio heads nervous, that contracted the professional opportunities of people who crossed him, that turned a legal document into an instrument of public punishment, that question deserves a specific answer. The answer is network. Not personality, though his personality was formidable. Not talent, though his talent was extraordinary. Network, the specific geography of relationships that connected him to the entertainment industry's most lucrative and most consequential professional infrastructure. At the height of the Rat Pack era, Las Vegas was not merely a performance circuit. It was the entertainment industry's highest revenue live performance market, and access to its major venues was determined not by formal booking criteria, but by relationship. The owners of those venues, the individuals who made decisions about who performed in the rooms that generated the most significant income available to a live performer, were people whose social and professional lives intersected with Sinatra's in ways that were neither incidental nor casual. They were relationships built over time, maintained with intention, and understood by everyone in the industry to be the geography through which professional opportunity moved. This meant that Sinatra's displeasure was not merely personal, it was professional. Because the people whose displeasure would have professional consequences for a performer were, in many cases, people for whom Sinatra's friendship was a significant social and commercial asset. Crossing Sinatra did not simply mean losing his goodwill. It meant losing access to a professional geography that he did not formally control, but that was substantially shaped by his relationships. The documented cases of performers whose access to Las Vegas venues contracted after personal conflicts with him are not attributed to formal blacklisting. There was no list, no formal mechanism, no institutional process. There was simply the social arithmetic of a relationship-based industry, the quiet recalibration of who was available for which engagements, conducted through conversations that no investigator would ever be asked to examine. Mia Farrow was 21 years old when she married Sinatra, 30 years her senior, and those who observed their early relationship described it as one of genuine mutual devotion. A young woman of considerable gifts and ambitions of her own, and a man who could be, in his warmer moments, extraordinarily attentive and generous. The production of Rosemary's Baby, directed by Roman Polanski, created the circumstance that revealed the nature of his expectations most clearly. Sinatra had a film of his own in production simultaneously and wanted Farrow available for it. The schedules could not be reconciled. His solution was direct. She should leave Rosemary's Baby. She should abandon the production, abandon the role, and make herself available according to his requirements. Farrow, who understood what the role represented for her career, who had fought to be taken seriously as a performer rather than simply as Sinatra's young wife, declined. He had divorce papers delivered to her on the set of Rosemary's Baby. The timing was not incidental. A legal document he delivered at her place of work, in front of her colleagues, at the moment of her greatest professional commitment. This was a public act, and its public character was its point. The message was not primarily legal. It was professional and personal simultaneously. This is what declining costs. The industry observed this. It drew its conclusions. Not because anyone formally cataloged what had happened, because the people who needed to understand it had watched it happen, and the watching was sufficient. No one stopped him, because stopping him required absorbing consequences that extended beyond professional disagreement into the geography of relationships that his retaliation moved through. Studios were not constituted to protect individual performers from other performers' social networks. The unions had no mechanism designed for addressing informal geography-based exclusion. And the press, which understood what was happening, had learned, across the decades this documentary has examined, that the cost of confronting certain kinds of power exceeded the editorial value of the story. Mia Farrow completed Rosemary's Baby. She delivered one of the most extraordinary performances in the history of American cinema. The film was released in 1968 and stands today as a genuine masterwork. She had chosen her art over his expectations, absorbed the personal consequences of that choice, and created something that has outlasted every attempt to define her as anything other than the exceptional performer she was and is. The film she protected stands as its own answer to the question of whether the choice was worth it. Some choices answer themselves. This was one of them. For decades, The people who built Hollywood's golden age asked one thing of their audiences. They asked us to sit in the dark, to look at the light on the screen, and to believe in the glamour and the romance and the apparent effortlessness of it all. To accept the image without asking what it cost to maintain it. And we did. Willingly, lovingly, and across generations. What we now know is that the belief was not free. It was purchased at a price paid by specific people in specific moments that this documentary has tried to name with the honesty they deserve. Lana Turner, who walked through those gates as a teenager with dreams of her own. Kim Novak, who came to Hollywood with a spirit her friends called genuinely free. Shirley Temple, who was 10 years old and told her mother, and whose mother went to the right person and learned what the right person thought of it. Marilyn Monroe, who trusted a teacher with her wounds and left him, in the end, the rights to her face. The performers on DeMille's sets, who found that the only language available to them converted their suffering into evidence against themselves. The women who told the truth under oath before congressional investigators and watched that truth be set aside. Mia Farrow, standing on the set of Rosemary's Baby with divorce papers in her hand and a performance still to deliver, and delivering it anyway. These were not people who failed to fight back. They were people who fought inside a system specifically engineered so that fighting back produced no result. Their courage was real. The constraints placed around it were simply larger. The films they made inside those constraints, the ones we grew up with, the ones we return to, the ones we carry through our lives as a particular kind of beauty that belongs to this era and no other. Those films are not diminished by knowing what surrounded them. If anything, they are more remarkable, because now we understand what it actually took to make them. Not just the talent, not just the craft, but the endurance. Hollywood's golden age was exactly as beautiful as we remember it. It was also exactly as complicated as we have spent this hour beginning to understand. Both of those things are true, and the willingness to hold both of them at once, without flinching from either, is the only honest way left to love it. If these stories have mattered to you tonight, if you believe that the full truth of Hollywood's golden age deserves to be told with the care and the honesty it has always deserved, please share this with someone who loves these films as much as you do. And leave us a comment telling us which of these figures surprised you most, and which story from the golden age you think still hasn't been told. We read everyone, and those conversations shape everything we do here. Until next time, this is Golden Age Files, where the glamour and the truth have always belonged together.